How about we could go get something?
Okay.
And they hear you at all times. If I say something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oops. Hello.
Hello.
Hello, everybody. So we are going live in right now. Hello, hello. And so here we are. Hello. Hello, everybody. We are here and we are beginning our 27 live talk about coping. And this time is the time of joy and also stress for many people. And we also know how many people were on the streets just a month ago, a few weeks ago, rioting and picketing. And I see some blinking here. So I'm so excited today because during this very stressful time, it is very important to be calm, to pray and to hope that everything will work for the best. And so here we are hosting today Geri Crain. Geri, I will put you on the screen as soon as you will start speaking alone. And so you will see that we will change the setting and the layout on the street. I'm Lydia Istomina. And we started this program back in April when we realized that with COVID, we cannot have live interaction with people. And since coping became such an important topic, we went live. And since then, this is our 27 live talk. So today we are talking about racism. Racism is such a hot topic and also painful topic for many. And that's why I invited Geri Crain, who has her own very soft way to talk about such painful subject. And sharing the story of her mother, we will hear something that might give us a lesson how to act in a situation that we are dealing every day now around us in America and around the world. So, Geri, I invite you to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lydia. I have known Lydia for many years now, and we are personal friends, but also we share something like a golden thread through our relationship over the years, and that is that when my mother was alive and visited Kansas City, where Lydia and I were living at the time, Lydia invited my mother to speak. And that has been a tradition that I've been very fortunate to carry on. So thank you, Lydia, for having me today. I will just give myself a brief introduction, and then we will go on from there. I think I will share my screen, or at least attempt to, after that time. So thank you for joining us today. My name is Geri Crain, and I am a dentist and a dental educator by training, but I had the very fortunate opportunity to hear my mother tell her story many, many times, and I think it really helped to shape me and who I am today and my world view, and also to share her story with others as she did so many times before. Let me go ahead and try to share because I have a few photos that I wanted
to. And while you're doing that, I will introduce our moderators today. So we have Candice Sheehan, who is a co-author of our program, and Scott Kiddle. And also, I'm very honored today to have David Lawson, who is a psychologist and consultant. And so during this coping time, people have difficulty to cope. And I thought, David, that having you on our program, having this podcast, it will be very important for you to have your insight on this particular topic today and hopefully in the future. So good to have you all. Let's begin now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Geri. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just trying to pull up my slides. Lydia, I also sent you a new copy of the slides in your email. If for some reason I'm not
I
able
just have
to,
that.
maybe you could pull them up. For some reason. I love,
And so while
love
and while
technology
they're
when it
doing
works.
that, okay, so let me know when you're ready. And
Yes.
meanwhile, I just want to see that where are we? Like we have 3 moderators today, and I thought that this topic of racism is very important, not because only it is racism in America, but not too many people know that racism has many faces, and they're not necessarily black. Because I'm from Russia, and until 1861, actually the same year when slavery was ended in the United States, then slavery ended in Russia. But that's what Geri will talk about, that because slaves can be white. And in Russia, white masters owned white slaves. Those people who did not have last names, people who had no history of their families, they could be sold or exchanged on puppies. Women can be killed for no reason. And so it's just a very sad time when a human being has no value. And that's why it should never be repeated. So, Geri,
Yes.
are you ready?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And were you able to find my slides?
I don't see them yet, so and that's why it should never be repeated. So, Geri,
Yes.
I don't see them yet. How about if you start speaking and maybe
Sure.
by this time? Yes, okay.
Okay. So just to share with you, I would like to talk about my mother's story, and I'll move through it rather quickly because I think what's more important that I'd like to bring forward are some of the lessons learned from her experience in the Holocaust and how they can apply even today, or even especially today of all days. So I am the youngest of 4 girls in the family. My mother was born in Sighet, Romania, and she did experience the Holocaust. She didn't talk very much about it when we were girls growing up. We grew up in Portland, Oregon, and in hindsight, I can see that my mother and my father, also a Holocaust survivor, very much tried to raise us as integrated into American society. So they didn't talk much about their previous experiences. It wasn't until I was a young adult, I was actually after college in dental school at the time when my mother wrote a book. And her book was called Tapestry of Hope, and it was her memoir. And she did not write it for the intention of publishing a book. She was new to this country before I was born, and she was learning the language. She was learning English, and she heard on the radio, if you have something inside, something that's bothering you, take a pen and a pencil and a paper and just start writing. It was before computers back then. And just write down your thoughts. And that's what she did. She wrote down her memories because she had such a wonderful, beautiful childhood. And she didn't want to lose those memories. So as she was writing through her memories, chronologically, it came through to the time in her life and her own story where it came to the Holocaust. And she continued writing. And it was through those writings that she actually ended up with a stack of papers like this. She wrote in her first language, which was Hungarian. Then as she learned the language, she changed to English, but she always just wrote on paper until one day she met a priest who said, "Alice, I see you have a tattoo on your arm. Can you tell me about the Holocaust?" And she said, "Well, I don't really talk about it, but if you're interested, I have some papers that you could read." And he did. And he called her in a week and he said, "Alice, I am a priest, but I am also a publisher, and I'm going to make your book. And he put it together into a book. And it was at that point that my mother really found her voice. And she began speaking at churches and schools and all over the place. Anyone who would ask her, she would share her story. And I was so fortunate to get to accompany her for years. And after she passed away about 10 years ago, I began to tell her story as well. So she grew up in Sighet, Romania. Some of you may have heard of Elie Wiesel. Yes. He was a Nobel laureate. Yeah. He was sometimes called the spokesperson for the Holocaust because he was a wonderful writer, and he wrote the book Night. Mm-hmm. Many students in high school and middle school in the United States read this book called Night by Elie Wiesel. Well, my mother and Elie Wiesel were born in the same hometown. Yes. Mm-hmm. And when the kids would ask my mother, "Oh, did you know Elie Wiesel?" And she said, "Elie? Yeah, he was a scrawny little brother of a girlfriend of mine." Mm-hmm. So fast forward, he became Nobel laureate. But it's very interesting to hear his story from a man's perspective, a boy's perspective at the time, and my mother's perspective of similar events, but from the woman's point of view. So my mother had a wonderful childhood. I think that she was a little bit spoiled. She had two older brothers. She was the three and the only girl. And her family, although they were Jewish, which at the time and in Romania at the time, the Jews could not own land, but instead her father owned a shop. They did well. Her parents, especially her father and her grandmothers, were very devout Jewish, would go to the synagogue, and they had a nice life. My mother talked about how she had piano lessons and French lessons and English lessons and those type of things. She described her home and her living room, which we called the salon. It was a beautiful room. I actually was able to stand inside that room and visit it 50 years after she was dead, but still, it was a beautiful room with curved ceilings, and it was in there where her family kept her grand piano, and she loved that piano and played. She loved music and dancing, and where she would go to practice her piano. She had many friends and so many girlfriends, and as she grew up through the years and then became a teenager, they did not have these. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have internet. So the way that they socialized was after school, they would go for these walks on the street, on the sidewalk, and they would promenade. They would dress up because you never knew who you would see or who you would be seen by. Might be that boy that you have a crush on, whatever. They dressed up and they would walk along the streets after school and after dinner in the evening. And that was how they socialized. It was a
Geri, could I ask a question, please?
Yes.
I wanted to know, as your mother was growing up, was she socialized? Was the Jewish community very much by itself, or were they part of the broader?
They were absolutely. Thank you for the question. They were.
I needed to understand that part.
Absolutely part of the community. Now, her friends knew that she went to a synagogue. She knew that her friends went to the church, but they loved each other, especially the children. The children and the teens amongst each other. Mm-hmm. Very well accepted in society. Now, there were little signs. For example, the Jewish people weren't able to own land. So that was something. That was a kind of a systemic racism, a little hint at that.
Right.
Some other things, once in a while, she heard that somebody would say something bad about Jews because they killed Jesus. And she said, I didn't kill Jesus. I don't know this doesn't apply to me. So, but really, for the most part, it was a wonderful and thriving community. both Jews and non-Jews, and everybody seemed to get along very well in her perspective.
Okay.
Now, that began to change. And what happened was that as World War II and Hitler came to power, and then the war began, her parents really didn't tell her much. They didn't talk to her much about politics or bad things that were happening in the world. So she really remained very innocent through her teenage years. But things started to happen. For example, there were some restrictive laws that came out. And this is, they didn't have the term systemic racism back then, but it really, listen to these things that were happening with our ears of today, and you can hear that's what was going on. There were some restrictions that would come out. For example, Jewish men could no longer own businesses. That was something that was what her father had a deli shop and was importing cheeses and meats and having a very nice business, and couldn't have that anymore. Why? Because you're Jewish? It just didn't make sense. But the people were very law-abiding, and so, they tried to figure out what else to do. That was very stressful for her father, and in time, he did have a heart attack and died, so that was very sad. But they kept going. At one point, another law came that said Jewish girls could no longer go to school. They couldn't be educated. And so my mom said, I was never that good at this anyway, so no bother. I just stopped going to school. I practiced my piano, and I still got together with my friends after school. But later, there was another rule, another restriction that came out that said Jewish people can no longer walk on the sidewalk. Now, this was already in the 1940s. But her town was a very small town. It was very elegant, and they still mostly used horse and carriage and to deliver things across the town. It was small enough that one could walk, but if they weren't cars, they were horses. And when I talk with kids, when I tell my mother's story, I say, what do you think was in the street? If there was horses in the street, what do you think was also in the street? And you get them to say poop. Okay, so my mom at that point, remember, they dressed up in their best clothes to walk on the street and socialize. Now she had to walk in the street, not the sidewalk. She didn't want to get her shoes dirty, so she stopped going on these wonderful promenades, these walks. So they stayed home. Around this time, there was another law, and this was a bad one. This was that people who lived in this side of the town who were Jewish had to give up their homes and they had to move into this other part of town. And they called this part of town ghetto. And my mother's home was in this part of town, so she did not have to move, but they had to open up their house to strangers, to other Jewish families who had to come over into their home. And it was strange. Nobody knew why. Nobody knew what was going on, but they were law-abiding. So, they just and wait. She went into her living room one day to practice the piano. There was a family in there looking so sad, and they had stacked their pots and pans up on her piano. She said, "Oh, forget it." Closed the door and played her piano again. Lydia, thank you so much. You found some slides. And so let me tell you where I am on my slides. If you want to just go through them, this is just a slide. This one is a slide of the movie house in town. And this is, it was a wonderful gathering place in the community. And this is my mother. She's the little one in the family, her older brother, and mother and father. Another older brother was already in medical school in the Sorbonne in Paris at this time. But the family would take promenades and walk, and there's the movie theater in the background. And then again, 50 years later, when I visited her town there. And then on the next slide is where we are. And this is my mother. My favorite picture. This is her in the 4th grade. She loved dancing. She got the leading role in the school play. She was the Red Rose. She loved dancing. And the Red Rose was her character. And here she was promenading, walking as a young adult, probably 19, 20 years old with 2 of her girlfriends before the restrictive laws came. So now they were in the ghetto. They were in this very tight quarters with many families. One day, the order came, all the boys and the men had to leave. They took them. The men took them. These were the Nazis. They came and they took them, or the Hungarians who were under the Nazi control at that time. This is when Elie Wiesel was taken. At one point, and Elie describes this in the book Night, at one point a boy escaped after some time and he came back to their hometown, and he snuck into the ghetto and he said, "You would not believe what happened. They took all the boys and men, they took us out, and they took us, and there was a large ditch, a large hole in the ground that we had to stand around, and they shot us in our backs, and we fell in. Most people fell into it and died." He did not get shot. This young boy was able to somehow miraculously escape and come back. He talks about that. Elie Wiesel does in his book. My mother remembers that boy coming back and saying, "You would not believe it, what they did, and they shot us." And guess what? They didn't believe him. They didn't believe him. Because remember, this was not a violent time. These people did not grow up with violent movies or people carrying guns. This was unheard of. And so they couldn't. These people did nothing wrong. Why were they being shot? This was unheard of. They didn't believe him. But time went on, and eventually the loud, angry order came for all of the men, the women, the children, and any sick people who were left behind had to get out and line up in the street. And there people, and this is why I asked the children, what would you bring if you were asked suddenly to pack up and just get out in the street and leave? First of all, you don't know where you're going, why you're going, you don't know how long you'll go. What would you bring with you? And so some people carried valuables, some people had suitcases, anything they could think to grab. But it was a long walk, and in time they were very tired and dropped things along the way. And they saw people in the town looking out their windows at this long line of so sad looking people, so scared, being marched along. They didn't know where. Lydia, I'm still back on the picture of my mother and her girlfriends. They did not know, those who were not Jewish did not know where these people were being taken. And they were being marched to the train station. Now, back then, when you took a train in Europe, it was very lovely. You would take a train to Budapest or to France, and you would dress up to go on the train. It was kind of a fancy thing. But this was not this kind of train. This was cattle cars. Yeah. And they had just finished delivering cattle. And it smelled, and it was dirty, and it was very dark, and there was nothing but a small window of light that came in. Otherwise, nothing in there, no chairs, no nothing. And so the people were crammed into these cattle cars, women, children, older people, sick people crammed in. The doors closed and the train went on for 3 days, 2 nights. No water, no food, no toilet facilities, nothing. And my mother said some of the older people, the sicker people, did die along the way. But after 3 days, the doors opened up and the sunlight was blinding. And somebody yelled into them and said, "You have just arrived to Auschwitz, and this is a work camp." Now, my mother was 20 years old at this time. She was 21 at this time. And somehow this thought came to her mind. Her mother always told her, when you are 21, not more than 23 years old, you are supposed to get married and start to raise a family. And she always grew up hearing that. Now she was 21 years old. Doors came open. An angry voice told them this is a work camp. And her first thought was, I am 21 years old. I am going to work. I'm going to survive because I need to get married and have a... Yeah. So she and the others who were there jumped down into a very long line, and they were walking toward this platform with a man up above, standing in this platform, looking at every person in the line and motioning to the left, to the right. He never said a word. He only motioned. And when he came to my mother, he motioned for her to go to her right. He motioned to her mother, who was there with 2 little cousins, to go to their left. And my mom, out of instinct, wanted to stay with her mom and the cousin, so she turned to the left. And the man on the platform was angry, and a soldier with a gun with a bayonet, the teeth, knife on the end of the gun, came to my mother and scared her because told her to go to her right, separate from her mother, that she did dare to disobey this man on the platform. She found out later that this man was the infamous Dr. Mengele.
Oh my. Yeah.
He motioned for her to go to her right. Her mother and the cousins went to the left. She never saw them again. She was taken through these gates that showed that they opened up, and they were taken into some wooden barracks, and there met with girls who took their clothes in exchange for a type of a gray, drab, scratchy dress. They all looked the same, and clothes were taken, shoes were taken, and they were given these bad dresses and some other shoes. My mother's feet were very small. She was a very petite woman, so her shoes, they gave her back her own shoes because they couldn't find anything else small enough to fit her. Then they took scissors and razor blades and shaved their heads. My mother had beautiful brown curls. She said they just fell to the ground. And she watched and looked on the ground, and there were these brown curls, and she said, no matter, I will grow more.
Wow.
We always grow more. From there, they were taken into a barrack and into the routine that they were kept under for the next many, many months. And this was a difficult time. The winter was coming. Again, just with the gray dresses. They had to do some labor, and her job was to go with the other girls in her barrack into this other place. It was like a storehouse or a warehouse where you saw those pile of shoes. They had piles of clothes, piles of eyeglasses, all the types of things that were being confiscated from the people as they came off of the trains, especially those people who went to the left and were never seen again. And her job was with dull scissors to cut through clothing and make strips out of them and then braid those strips and roll them into balls. And they were told that those were being used by the German military, the Nazis, as fuses to light the fuse. It was during one of those times she was cutting through, and she found sometimes things in people's pockets or sewn into the seams of their clothing. I mean, people were hiding their valuables. They didn't know if they would be back home to get these things. One thing she found one time cutting through with a scissor was a little silver spoon. Must have been either a baby spoon or the kind that people collect when you go traveling. But somehow she liked that spoon, and she somehow kept it and hid it and held on to it. It was a very dangerous time for her because she was thin, petite to begin with, and she didn't eat very much anyway. But there in the concentration camp, they were given very little food and bad nutrition. And so she lost a lot of weight. And the woman who was in charge of their barracks, my mother and the girls who came from her hometown were in the barracks there. The woman in charge said, don't you ever get sick, or if you do, don't tell anybody about it, because if you lose too much weight or you get sick, then you will be selected and you will go up in smoke. And she went into this building where the chimney was constantly smoking. They didn't know what she meant, go up and smoke. What does that mean? But she knew that she was getting in danger when she became so thin and so frail. What happened? Many stories. I wish I had more time to go into them all, but she really did experience what she called miracles, in that she had several near misses with death, and somehow she survived one after the other. One thing she would tell the children when she spoke was, you would be so surprised at the imagination that the things your mind can come up with to save yourself, that your life is in danger. And she did that a few times. She really came up with some amazing solutions to possibly facing death. Then it became January of 1945. So she was 22 years old now, going to be in the spring, and the weather was cold and snowy. And an order came that said, everybody line up. We are going to leave this camp. Well, many women couldn't even walk anymore. They stayed behind, but she could still walk, and she still had her shoes. Some women didn't even have soles on their shoes left, and it was snowy and it was cold. But in that gray dress and her shoes, and all the women lined up, and they marched them out of the concentration camp. And they walked in pathways between farmhouses and between towns, and they had to sleep outside in the winter night. And they took them to more train tracks and another cattle car, but this time it was an open cattle car. There was no roof. And they went again 3 days, 2 nights on the cattle car. And on the third day, when they woke up in the morning, they shook their head and snow fell off. It had snowed on them during the night. Remember that little spoon she had? She took it. Somehow she still had it with her, and she took it and she ate the snow off of her spoon because her mother, her granny told her, you don't ever eat dirty snow. Don't eat yellow snow. The clean, fresh snow, she thought, I'm going to try it. And she took a sip, and it was good and refreshing. It was just a little bit of water for her. And those cattle cars ended up in another concentration camp deep inside Germany now. What happened was, this was nearing the end of the war, and the Russian front was coming to Poland to coming upon the Auschwitz concentration camp, and they liberated that camp. The Nazis did not want to leave any evidence behind what they were doing, so they tried to remove as many of the prisoners as possible, and that's what was called that death march. And my mother was on, same with Anne Frank and Corrie ten Boom, and others were on this death march. They ended up in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and this was a problem. This was a logistical problem for the Nazis, because unlike Auschwitz, where they did have the ovens and the chimneys where they were burning bodies, Bergen-Belsen was not set up to be a killing camp. It was more of a holding camp. And what do you do now when everybody is coming from all sides to try to end this war, and you have so many of these sick and near-death prisoners? How do you kill them when you don't have the machinery to do it? What they did was they stopped feeding them altogether. The once in a while they would throw in something that my mom described like a turnip, some kind of a one vegetable. They'd throw it into the barrack full of women and supposed to share it. And my mother couldn't even take a bite at that time. You might know through malnutrition, your gums and your gums bleed, and she had no more support to her teeth were wobbling in her head. She could not take a bite. At that point, many of the girls were dying. Every day they were dying, and they used to drag them out of the barrack and pile them up, their bodies, but then it became so high it was blocking off the window, and they couldn't reach high anymore to pile them up, so they just left them in there. And it was during this time my mother was really near death. And at one point she closed her eyes and she said, I went into a deep sleep. She said, I was at peace. Nothing hurt. I was peaceful. I was okay. And I was lying there in peace. And all of a sudden, shooting and loud noise and screaming and yelling. And she thought to herself, who dares to wake me up from this peaceful sleep? A man opened the door, and he had a beret on. He looked different than the Nazis, and he spoke English. And my mother, remember, she had English lessons, and she understood a little. And he said, the war is over, and you will be liberated. You will be free. At that point, my mother was 22 years old, and she weighed approximately 47 pounds.
Oh my.
She could not stand. She looked like, she described herself as like a living, breathing skeleton. Her legs looked like two sticks covered with skin. And she couldn't stand. She couldn't walk. And the ambulance drivers came and asked her where she would like to go. She said, I'd like to go home, of course, to Sighet, Romania. And her friends looked at her and said, Alice, you cannot go home. You have to go someplace to get better. They took her in ambulances. They took her to Sweden, who opened up their schools into makeshift hospitals. And they were so kind, and they helped to rescue these people. And then on to rehabilitation living facility for Jewish girls that they had set up in Sweden. And there it took many months before she could put on enough weight and begin to walk again. And she said two things saved her. One was she was such a picky eater before the war and all through her childhood, that even now, as she was trying to get back to health, she was a picky eater, and she would only pick at her food and only ate what she wanted to. And this actually ended up helping. Some of you may know, and we learned so much actually from that time medically, how to bring somebody back safely from a state of starvation. You don't want to eat yourself. because literally that can happen. Instead, I think that simple eating that she was doing actually helped her in the long run. But the thing that actually got her out of bed and moving and walking was that if she could lie in bed and her door was open and she could see down the hall and that door was open, there was a room with a piano in it. And she loved the music and loved the piano. And it was that love of piano that eventually she found the inner strength to get out of bed and walk down that hall to that piano so she could play the piano.
Yeah.
So during that time, nobody could come and visit except one person, and it was a man who was allowed to come in. Why? Because he was Jewish and he was a photographer, and he could come in to take pictures of the women. Now they had grown their hair back and they were putting on weight. They were trying to reunite people with their families who at that point were scattered all over Europe and even beyond. And so she had her picture taken and remembered the mailing address to her brother, who was at the medical school in Sorbonne, desperately trying to find family again. Well, this man came back, and he came back to where she was living in this facility, and they went for walks in the garden. Now, he spoke German, she spoke Hungarian, but my mother had a friend who spoke both languages. So this woman would walk between them and translate back and forth. And it was during one of those walks when he said, yeah, I could spend the rest of my life with her. And I said back through the translator, yes, I could spend the rest of my life with him too. And that was my father. And they were married and then stayed in Sweden for 2 more years, where my mother learned to speak German so they could communicate together. And then they both learned Swedish so they could live in society in Sweden, where a very wonderful family took them in and fostered them until they could be on their feet again, so to speak. During that time, my father's brother had emigrated to the United States in the Portland, Oregon area. And they said, okay, now come, we will sponsor you to come to the United States. Because the United States was not allowing just any or all people to immigrate. They were these so-called sanctuary cities with quotas. Only certain numbers of people could be brought in, but they were among the lucky. So they came to make their life in Portland, Oregon. And from there, my parents tried to raise us as American as they could. They really did not talk much about the Holocaust. Of course, we saw my mother's tattoo on her arm, and when my oldest sister was a little girl, she said, Mom, what are those numbers on your arm? And my mom said, don't worry about that. That's just Hitler's phone number. She just made a joke of it, and she was lighthearted about it. But she never lived in anger or hatred, and she really credited my father, who was a very peaceful man. He himself was captured and taken to Dachau concentration camp, but he was able to get out early in the war. He was taken on Kristallnacht, which was kind of the beginning end for the Jews. He was let out of Dachau because his sister-in-law was able to find work for my dad and his brother in another country. And at that time, they would let the Jews go out of Austria and work in these other countries, where this is how he ended up in Sweden. He was very peaceful, and he told my mother, don't you be angry, don't you hate, because it is that hatred that will eat you up inside. And so she said, okay. And she just focused on being happy and healthy and raising us in the best way she knew how. We had a wonderful childhood. She had a wonderful life from that point forward. Fast forward, in 1995, we had the opportunity to go back because my mother had already written her book. She published it in 1987, and she wanted to go back to the very place where her story unfolded. This was the beginning of our journey, and we brought it was the 4 girls, my mom, and we hired a videographer to come with us. And we told him, you are going to be our brother for 21 days. And we filmed a documentary called A Journey to Remember. And it was a wonderful experience. Fast forward many years after that, that was a picture of my mother in Portland, Oregon, where she had the idea to leave a legacy to those who perished in the Holocaust. And this is the Holocaust Memorial in Portland, Oregon, in Washington Park. And it's still there today. It's an educational destination for people to visit, for school children to come and learn some history about the Holocaust. It's also a place where the survivor community in Portland could come and say goodbye to their own family members who perished because they never had that kind of closure. There is no cemetery that she could visit to say goodbye to her own mother or their entire extended family. Her 2 brothers survived. My mother survived. She was reunited in time over the years with her brothers, and they just have created wonderful memories once again in their lives afterward. I would like to stop at this point and open it up for questions, and also if we could try to carry the conversation and the lessons learned into today's perspective. What are some things that come to your mind when you think
Yes,
about? Go ahead.
absolutely. We have, and I'm sure that our moderators and our audience has lots of questions at this time. So please, who would like to start?
I'd be happy to. So Geri,
I have a question. Go ahead.
so Geri, I am just deeply appreciative of the fact that you are telling this story. I grew up in a neighborhood in Chicago where there was a large young Jewish population, and back in the 70s, late 70s, there was a neo-Nazi group that was going to march in Skokie, Illinois, and when they were denied that, they were going to come. The plan was to come march in my town, and that didn't happen either. So I grew up keenly aware of the Holocaust, but there was recently a study done that said 2/3 of Generation Z and millennials have no idea what the Holocaust is about.
Yeah.
What thoughts do you have on how that's even possible?
Yeah. Scott, thank you for bringing both of those things to light. There are now, last time I checked, and I could need to update my data, but last I checked, there were 12 states in the United States that now require Holocaust education in the schools.
Oh, good.
So this is wonderful. We know that in Germany and Poland, it is actually against the law to deny that the Holocaust happened.
Yeah.
So it's this type of thing that's going to keep that history alive. I think talking about the stories, talking about the lessons learned about this is systemic racism to the nth degree.
Absolutely. Yeah.
With state-sponsored genocide. You have all the history unfolded in our documents, in our history, in our scholarly work. So this is undeniable. When you mentioned this about Skokie, and how they came to your town but did not happen. The chief of I was once very fortunate to hear the former chief of police of Portland who then became the chief of police in Billings, Montana, said, because there was also a neo-Nazi group rising in Portland, and then that didn't work, and then in Billings, and they came there, and that didn't work. And he said, this is a vocal minority of the people, and the message that we have to meet them with, that dissolves their message, is not in our town.
Yeah.
We will not allow this in our town. And
Absolutely.
that's one reason why it drove them away from Portland and into Billings. When it became known that they were going to do whatever they were going to do on a certain day or time in Billings, the newspaper printed on the front page in huge black letters, not in our town. And every townsperson, Jewish or non-Jewish, taped it in their window.
Yeah.
And they said, nope, we are not having it. And they left. So it was interesting. My mother spoke in so many different high schools, and children would line up afterwards to ask her questions or give her a hug. And one time I didn't accompany her on this time, but she came home and we were chatting, and she said, Geri, what does it mean when somebody has a hair like this? She was showing me a spiky mohawk with her hand. And I said, well, and she said, he told me he was in a neo-Nazi group. And he heard what I said after my story. He came up and he gave me a hug. And he said, I'm in this neo-Nazi group and I didn't even know what that meant. But now that I hear your story, I'm going to quit, and I'm going to get my brother to quit too. So that just reinforced her message of education and sharing the story and sharing the lessons learned. And if you can even change one person's mind, then your job is done. And she changed somebody's mind that day. But I happen to know she inspired thousands of people over the years.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Well, I know Lydia is having some technical challenges in her studio. Candy or Dr. Lawson, do you have any questions?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your talk. It's really good, and I think from my perspective, I've been, I was working with people with anxiety, even before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hits, and it goes way up, and then the protest, and it goes way up. So I kind of got tired of talking about anxiety, and I started talking about resilience.
Yes.
And how you can, let's not focus on all these things that are making us anxious. Let's start looking at things that can create resilience and help us, cope with things, which is kind of what this is about. And I put that together a lot with, I've always kind of been, family systems is one of my things, the generational transmission of traits from one to another, from this generation to this generation. And clearly your mother's parents gave her some qualities that I believe helped her survive in this. And it's interesting that she didn't talk about this much with you, but what was it about her parenting style that helped you, that you kind of look back on now and go, you know what, I bet that was because of what she went through?
Yeah, wonderful question. I think, looking back, I think it was that she was always optimistic and always respecting of others, and of course modeled that to me. She didn't have hate, she didn't have anger, so that was her basic core personality trait. I think that passed on was that good and happy and loving. That was it. Then when I came to learn her story more as an adult, then I started putting things together and understood, wow, there's the resilience piece. I mean, coming, first of all, surviving that and coming back from that, but then moving to a new country and starting with no money and no language and a new baby and having to figure all of that out. There's a lot of resiliency that was built in there. Absolutely. One of the things I want to just peel the onion layer back a little bit more on the resiliency piece, because I think, again, this is maybe a little nugget that we can bring forward in our lives right now with all of the challenges. And that is, she was very focused during the Holocaust, during the concentration camp experience, very focused on her goal. And her goal was of survival and of not being more than 23 years old and getting married and starting. And guess how old she was when my first sister was born?
Was she 23?
She was. And she said, I made it.
Oh, wow.
I made it.
Yeah.
But I think that being focused on a goal and have it be a positive goal gave her and allowed her the ability to hope and to stay focused on that goal. Even when times got tough, she was very focused on that goal, and that's what brought her through. Hope and focus.
Geri, I remember your mother, Alice Kern, so well. You and her came to our church a long time ago. I was back in Raytown. And what really surprised me, first of all, you mentioned how tiny she was. She was really petite. And it was something about her that really impressed my friends and my church members. She was speaking so quietly, but with such strength. And, there was no pathos. And, when now people speak too much and lots of demagogy, and it's like back in Russia when people try to make it into history. And for example, people will say, oh, we participated in this event. And when historians start counting, then they say, wait a second, it doesn't make any sense, because people who helped, for example, Lenin to carry this piece of wood, and the piece of wood probably was like maximum 5 feet. Then there was like thousands of people who carried it with him. And so what I did not see in your mother was not even a single note of pride or bragging. She was just telling the story. And I know that Candy and Scott met you when you spoke last year in St. Joseph. And you have the same mannerism, speaking about such tragic things, when others will probably be inflamed with anger and hatred, and inviting others to join the army and get out on the streets. So how do you think your mother was able to live her life with such a kind of quiet attitude and disposition?
People would ask her a similar question, Lydia, and one of the things she said was, she really drew from her wonderful upbringing. Her childhood was so happy. She was so loved. She had a wonderful childhood. And so she went through terrible hard times. But one of the things that kept her going was that memory of her wonderful childhood. And that she drew on that as part of her, feeding that natural happiness and love that she had inside of her. That came from her. She also would say, though, because sometimes kids would come up to her, high school students would come up to her after she talked, and they would say, oh, I used to feel so sorry for myself for my problems. They are nothing compared to what you do. And she would say, no, you cannot compare people's pain. Everybody's pain is painful to them. And you have to find a way, find that resilience, find a way to come through it and to make that decision to overcome it, even though it's hard, just keep going and then live a happy life.
It's amazing because she never diminished the tragedy and the pain, but at the same time, she was able to calm other people down, and though acknowledging their pain and their trauma. So she
Yes.
would never say, "Oh, just forget it. Nothing, just live your life, be positive." She never said that. She was so respectful to other people's pain, though their pain was absolutely so much smaller maybe than what she experienced.
Yes.
It was just amazing to see that.
So, Dr. Lawson, I think you mentioned, passing traits through generation. My son, who just turned 14 years old, Lydia and Scott, Lydia, you were the first to visit
Yes.
and the first person to hold my baby.
You were so little.
14 years ago. He towers over me now. He wrote an essay this summer in a writing class, and the prompt was, if you could change one thing in the world, what would it be and why? And he said, compassion. I want people to learn to be compassionate more. I think we should have a compassion curriculum in the school. It's to be taught. And this is something we know in Holocaust education, that just as hate and discrimination can be taught or learned behaviors, so too can a rescuer mentality and compassion. So I think he was on to something. I never told him to say that. It must have come through in the genes.
Geri, I think you just answered the question that I was going to ask, and that is, what would you say to parents who are wanting to teach their children, raise their children to be resilient first, but compassionate second?
Oh, I think they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
I think they do. And I think, you become resilient and you build others up to become resilient. You are compassionate. You build others up to be compassionate. And these things, they go hand in hand. They coexist in the world. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
I like
And
that you brought up the word compassion, because early in the pandemic, I read articles from counselors that were working in New York City. And one of them wrote about how this is the first time that counselors and the client were going through the same thing at the same time.
Yeah.
I was experiencing the same fears they were experiencing.
Yeah.
And then it just got bigger, and I felt I kind of had to simplify my, make it easy even on myself.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I came up with some words. It was grace, compassion, acceptance, and gratitude, which I've added to that since then. But that just simplifies it sometimes.
Right.
If we and a lot of that is, sometimes it's towards ourselves and sometimes it's towards other people. But I think a lot of times we have to provide that for ourselves before we're able to provide that for somebody else. But I like that you brought up compassion, because I think it's kind of the opposite of what we see in a lot of places.
Sure. It's
So
And
interesting
don't you think my mother would have agreed with you that she
Absolutely.
came to those same words after her traumatic experience, and she led her life with those same framework? I agree.
I was reading a little bit on Elie Wiesel, and he had said, when a person doesn't have gratitude, something is missing in their humanity. And a person can almost be defined by his or her attitude toward gratitude.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I would agree.
I'm still, Geri is very interested in how was your mother able to keep her humanity in a situation and an environment that was absolutely inhumane?
Yeah.
Because when I've read lots of stories like Solzhenitsyn, lots of stories about the Russian Gulag, Soviet Gulag, where 20 million people were killed and lived in absolute hunger and starvation, or they had to work in these labor camps. And many people, on one documentary, I've heard that the author said, environment like this makes people animals. Everything humane disappears.
It's
And
true.
people just survive when they become what we have a saying in Russia, wolves. People become wolves to each other. So the strongest is the weakest. But how did your mother keep that empathy and that compassion? I know you mentioned her childhood, but still, when everything is against you and you're 42 pounds and hardly, probably not even able to move your feet. So how did she preserve that dignity in her?
This is a wonderful question. She talked about that. And in fact, Holocaust scholars have written about how did the victims maintain humanity during the Holocaust inside the concentration camps. And she witnessed a lot of the things, Lydia, that you were mentioning. There was very ugly behavior between women she was in the women's camp of Auschwitz, saw that. But she did not feel that. She made a conscious decision not to go there. Instead, tried to help others to also keep their humanity. So one of the cute story, and other scholars have written about this, but she mentioned it too, that here they are under starvation conditions, but they were all, at least the girls she was with were teenagers, young 20s, and knew that they were supposed to be getting married at some point and have a family. And there were some mothers, not many, because they, of a certain age, they were killed right away upon arrival. But there were some few mothers among the group. And the mothers took these other younger women and they would sit in the barracks and she would teach them recipes. She would teach them recipes. They're starving, but she wanted to pass on the tradition.
Sure.
You're going to need to know how to make this when you have your husband and your family. Another beautiful example. My mother loved music, and so did her girlfriends, and they used to sit and harmonize back home. When they found each other in the camps, they would sit in the barracks, and once in a while they would sing and harmonize.
Wonderful.
That's the amazing story, and
Acts
I
of
know
humanity, acts of resilience.
Yeah.
absolutely.
And strength of
What-
character. Oh my, your mother had to be so strong. Wow.
Yeah.
Impressive.
Yeah. What will be your advice, and everybody who are moderating today, for people who now during COVID, we have all these riots over racism, and the anger is just spilled all out on the streets. So, what will be your recommendation? And especially now after election, the news are out, and so people, it's like the country is divided 50-50. What can people do to remain calm, to accept that we are all humans and we all deserve to be alive and healthy? And so we have COVID, multiple traumas. COVID, we have racism, we have riots, we have election anger. So what is that? How can we remain humans in this?
Well, my word that comes to mind, Dr. Lawson used, is grace. I think we need to show ourselves and each other grace. And I am more inspired today than I have been in a long time. And that is, I don't think that because they're 50-50, like you said, Lydia, and we won't go into the math, but let's say there are some people who are happy today with the election results and some who are not happy today because of the election results. And my feeling is this is an opportunity to show grace and to reach a hand out and to be humans all together, and not to blame and not to look backward, but to look forward. And I think, I mean, I don't want to go political here, but I think we need to look at what is causing people, what has caused people underlying, what is the root cause of people to have become this way? And let's try to address that all together and moving forward.
Yeah, that is very, very important, to show grace, to show acceptance. And anything, David, Candy, or Scott, you can add to that.
Well, I think for me, there's a couple things that come to mind. The first kind of ties this with what we talked about today, and that's understanding it's not just today or 10 years ago or 50 years. It goes way back, and it's the fragmentation of certain races. When I was a kid, I heard my grandfather talk about his grandfather who moved the family from Kentucky to Missouri and bought like 1,000 acres of land. And I'm sure I could have found a black man my same age talking about his grandfather, talking about his grandfather, and that grandfather would have been in slavery.
Yeah.
And you think about how much that does set the stand, that just, once I understood that, I understood a lot of things. And that's just knowing that, if that's what happened 6 generations ago,
Right.
that explains a lot of what's going on today. And some of it hadn't stopped. And then I think the other thing on the other part of it is the 50-50 is I had some people messaging me and they're like, this is getting to me. And finally, I'm as neutral as you can get, And I said, well, here we go. I'll give it a shot. And I said, the spirit within you is greater than whoever the next president is.
Yeah.
And that spirit will motivate you to do things for people that will impact them far greater than those people will be able to impact them. And I said, and for some of them, it's what you've overcome so far, you've been able to overcome regardless of who is in charge of the company. I've been able to achieve great things in life and overcome things without any, it didn't matter who was there.
Yeah.
And then I think the third thing was, I said, find a place in your life that you can insulate from the political stuff going on. So you can be involved in this stuff, but find ways to take a break from it too, and dial into what's important. Usually your relationships with your kids, families, things like that, and just kind of go, because, I'm going to remember the time I spent with my kids 15 years ago a lot more than I remember who the president was back then. So.
Sure.
I think you mentioned something very important, David, because when you, Geri, said that your mother was able to live through this horror, absolutely horror, because she remembered and she chose to remember her wonderful childhood. But unfortunately, in this country and around the world, that's what I think we all need to work on, that all children have this wonderful childhood. And as long as we do not have it, then of course we will have continued anger and people feel like they are deprived of some same lifestyle or means or food or clothes or cars. But I think our goal should be to provide to all children equal opportunities. And then this way, maybe we can raise another generation. Because Candy is a teacher and you're a teacher yourself, but on a different level. And Scott and I are ministers and David is a counselor. So that's what we are all working on. That we are trying to help people. My sister is a teacher, and so I know what she's passionate about. She says, I'm not just teaching chemistry or physics. I try to help my students to become decent human beings and be able to be independent in their life and their thinking and being. So I'm so thankful to all of you for what you do, for how you live, and how you each of you demonstrate this calmness in this madness. So let's continue doing that and think about all children who deserve a better future. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Candy and David
Thank
and
you.
Scott for your time today. I really appreciate it. David, if you could say a little about your service, about your counseling service, because this is very important. People are desperate, and when people are desperate, they do desperate things, and lots of suicides now, and we learn more and more about that. And so could you maybe offer your services to people today when before we finish,
Yes,
and I could share your website.
at the beginning of the year, I thought my reach was pretty much the zip codes around the zip code where my office was. And I was pretty much, and I work with a lot of mood disorders, a lot of crisis, suicidal thoughts. But I also deal a lot with just life management. And I get a lot of people who are like, I've got it all and I'm miserable and I'm empty. I've chased it, I got it, and it meant nothing. And so then the pandemic hit, and I was like, the week before, I was like, you can't do online anything. You got to be you got to be able to. And then that Monday, I was doing online counseling, and it's 1,000 times better than what I thought it was going to be.
Good.
So I was kind of like, and I've always kind of had because I grew up in an extremely rural community where we wouldn't go. You're not going to go to counseling when you live in a town of 1,200 people.
No, you don't.
It's just not going to happen. And I've always kind of thought about people like that. And I got on a couple different platforms to where it didn't really matter where these people were. They could sign on. And so I was getting people out in the middle of Kansas and out in the middle of Missouri. And then I thought, there's other states I can get licensed in. And so it's like I said, this is like gotten a lot bigger in just 6 months.
Absolutely, yes.
And I think that, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I just think, if people, it doesn't matter. I think this has opened up a door for people that would have never gone to counseling, because when you're hurting, it takes a lot of effort to find a counselor, call that number, set up that appointment, get the energy to go to that office and overcome the anxiety, so on and so forth. And this, you can just turn on your laptop and here you go. And on one platform, all you need is your phone. You don't even have to, which I really thought that was out there. That works beautifully too. So
absolutely. And that's what I want to finish with, this logo that I have on the right corner of my screen, which is a logo for our Hope in Life talk, from misery to mystery. Because some people feel like it is misery, I cannot get out of it. But there is a way to turn things around and really learn the mystery. Life is still a mystery. And I really thank you for your time and presence. And let's meet next time. And next time will be dedicated to teachers and how they cope. And a wonderful couple will be sharing, Robin and Greg Ogdal, about teaching during this time. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye, David.
thanks a lot.
Thank you.